Welcome to a conversation with Calum Macintyre, how to be a climate activist in 2025. I'm Julie from Klimakultur.
And I'm Alan.
Also from Klimakultur.
Yes. How are you, Julia?
I'm fine. I'm excited for this talk. Calum Macintyre is a very inspiring person who I've learned a lot from the last few years here in Norway, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. What do you hope to learn and spend time on in this hour, Alan?
Well, we know that Calum has a lot of very interesting stories that he has experienced himself, both from Norway and UK and maybe other places too. So, no, I think it's just interesting to get to put those stories into the light and just inform people how it is being an activist.
Especially in Norway, I think the conditions may be different than many people think. So on the note of that, let's get today's guest in here. Hello, Calum.
Oh. Hello, nice to see you.
Would you like to start by introducing yourself and also how you spent your night?
Yeah, so my name is Calum. I'm originally from Scotland, but I live in Sogndal in Norway, a small town on the west coast, if there's people that are not Norwegian here. And I work mainly with this campaign in Norway called Folk Mot Fossilmakta, which is a civil disobedience campaign here. And yes, I spent my night sleeping in the back of my car because every week I go to Bergen at the moment to host a talk about upcoming actions that we have there, which I guess we're going to talk about in this chat. And last night there's already one tunnel which is closed for roadworks. So I'm having to go a different way when I drive back. But yesterday, my other way also was closed. So the guy who offered me, or the guy who at the ferry who told me it was closed, said that I could drive like a 5-hour reroute. So I just decided to sleep in my car. Luckily, I put my sleeping bag in the car. I don't really know why. Must have just had a feeling something like that was going to happen.
It's a hard life being an activist in Norway.
Yeah.
So how long have you been, do you think climate activist is a good word for what you are? Are you comfortable using it? For some people, it's a positive word. For other people, it's a very negative word. How would you like to describe yourself?
I mean, personally, I don't like it because I just think it's a really easy way to then separate what we're doing away from the general public. But I also don't really know a better word, so I'm kind of like I've sort of accepted it. But I personally just kind of like, I don't know. I just like saying that we're citizens or just like engaged citizens, because that's basically what so many of the people that I'm in contact with are. They're just like regular people. So in some ways, yeah, I don't really like people pushing this whole kind of like activist. I mean, that's like one of the things that I like to try to get across is that we're just regular people who are just engaging because our politicians are massively failing us.
It creates a bit of distance between normal people and activists.
Yeah, because then it's just much easier to be like, oh, that's like, it's for those people over there. And I mean, I face that problem a lot. Like so many people that I talk to are like, oh, I love what you're doing. It's so good that you engage yourself. And I'm like, yeah, well, like, it's not just for us.
So when did you start becoming extra engaged in these issues? When did you become a climate advocate?
It's funny actually. I just launched like a Substack channel, and I was like doing a sort of intro post there, and I put in a picture of me when I was like I don't know how old I was, probably like 1 year or maybe less than a year, in a backpack with my mum in the newspaper with the title like "Protesters might face trouble from the law." I think my parents have been like really politically engaged since I was a baby. And so I have always had quite a lot of engagement like with what's going on. And I remember it was when I was a kid, actually, it was quite embarrassing. We were asked at nursery, like kindergarten, what our favorite TV program was. And I remember my dad was very, very embarrassed about this, or maybe not embarrassed, probably proud to. But everyone was asked like what the favorite TV program was, and everyone was like, "Oh, you know, a cartoon or cartoon this." And then I said BBC News because that was the only thing that we watched on our TV. So yeah, I've been engaged since I was really young. But I think for me, like it got much more. I came to Norway in 2016, and I took a master's in like climate change policy. And then I did like various different things. Like I worked for a research company, and I did stuff for an NGO, and I did like emissions reductions, like projects where I live and things. But I did this last couple of years. I just really saw this, felt this very deep frustration that it just seems like like not even just politicians, but just like leaders in society are just like not taking this issue with the severity that is required at all. And I think especially for me, this whole, I think it was in 2021 or 2022, this paper came out called The Future of the Human Climate Niche, and I read it, and it was all about how like 25% of the population of the world will be put into areas which are basically uninhabitable for humans. And I think that just really shocked me to the core, to be honest, and made me really think like it's not, I don't know, I just didn't feel it was like authentic enough to just be kind of doing things nicely. So then I got much more involved in activism and civil disobedience, and how we can learn from history to push for change.
I think it's like when you think about others, like you explain your engagement into this really, really well, and you think about everything that happens around you, and you read reports, and you act on what you read and what you see. Do you feel like you're very alone in that, or do you see people around you engaged the same way?
I mean, I'm quite lucky because I now have like a very strong community of people who are also kind of are taking action. But I must say, like, I do feel a bit lonely amongst my regular friends, and especially like, I'm really into like kind of outdoor sports like snowboarding and climbing and these kind of things, and it's a bit of a lonely space, to be honest, in that environment, because it just doesn't really feel like people on the whole take it very seriously. And I sort of really wish that they would take it more seriously, because we're also a bit like the canaries in the coal mine. All of my friends, especially this winter, has been like the worst winter ever for most of my generation. It just doesn't really seem, I don't know why, it just doesn't really seem like the people that I'm in contact with most seem to really, I think they get it, I just don't really know if they know what to do. Like they're just missing this like pathway to action kind of. So it does feel a bit lonely in that regard, but it's obviously been really nice to like get in contact with you guys, and just like build up more of a community in Norway of people who actually are engaged. And I think that's really like, I've felt like the last years sometimes, you know, like quite down about just like the way the world is going. And I think that really helps to have people around who also kind of get it, and you can talk to them about it. I feel quite sorry for a lot of people who are like not involved in the activist community, for example, because they don't have that at all. And everyone can see what's like, you know, the way the world is going.
You were speaking about this winter being the worst for people who likes snow and doing stuff on snow. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the action Folk Mot Fossilmakta did in Trondheim just a month or two ago on the World Championships on skis, where you did a very interesting action with a very interesting outcome.
Yeah, yeah. In some ways, for me, it was actually it was very lucky that it was like the worst winter ever, because then I didn't need to spend so much time off on my snowboard, which I normally would have done. So there was a lot more time to dedicate to the world champs in skiing, and basically trying to get them to, like, what we wanted to do in our campaign was to just like basically hijack Equinor's, which is a Norwegian state-owned oil company's sponsorship of the event, like hijack it and basically make the conversation about fossil fuel sponsorship and climate change. And I think it was honestly surprisingly successful. We were surprised ourselves. I think many people, or everyone who was watching that unfold in the media and stuff, like, have no clue how few people actually pulled that campaign off with very little resources. And so I think for us it was like surprisingly successful. We were quite taken aback. So basically what we did was, like, in January, Equinor it was announced last April that Equinor was going to sponsor the World Championships in skiing, which, you know, to any normal person, it does look a bit ridiculous having an oil company sponsor a skiing event which relies on there being snow, which the oil companies are making less and less likely every year because of the burning of fossil fuels. To any sane person, that probably looks a bit ridiculous, but in Norway it's just completely accepted as a normal thing, and every famous skier has grown up from when they were a kid wearing the Equinor logo, and it's really developed this like culture, especially in skiing, of just oil is good. They just associate oil and Equinor with as a good thing, and it's so different to like how other countries, people in other countries, like, relate to oil, I think. And it's so interesting for me as someone that's come from Scotland, we're also an oil producing nation, but we just don't, like, not even close, have the same relationship with oil as we do in Norway. And that's, I think, purely down to the sponsorship, because basically every kid in Norway has just been exposed to the Equinor logo since they were a kid, and see all their heroes, from skiing to music to cycling, whatever, wearing the Equinor logo. So yeah, we just wanted to like break that down, basically. So we announced in January that we were gonna disrupt the 50K race on the 8th of March if this skiing world championships, if the organizers weren't committing to taking away all the Equinor logos and showing a video, an educational video about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty at the event on the big screens. And just like one funny story from that is that it was a group of not Norwegians that kind of came with the idea for this, and I think we didn't really realize how big the 50K race was in Norway.
Oh, it's like holy. Oh, Alan said you was 50K. You're Norwegian and like skiing.
There's a lot of history there. It's like the one event in like cross-country skiing, I would say, during the year. So if it's the World Championships, or if it's in Holmenkollen or in the Olympics, that's the like main thing, at least for Norwegians and Swedes, I think.
Yeah, I guess we probably could have done slightly more research, man, because we were slightly taken aback by how, like, what the reaction was when we announced it in a press conference at the start of January. And I had like messages from friends being like, "Oh my God," and like, what are you thinking? Have you gone mad?" So that was a bit funny, actually. Yeah. I wonder if we would have actually announced that if we had really known how big it was, because like even when it got to the 8th, you know, like, we were there. We'll get more into that, I guess, but we were there, and it was quite shocking. It felt like it was even bigger than like the 17th of May celebrations in Norway. Hundreds of thousands of people. So yeah, do you want me to? Shall I tell a bit of the story, or?
But Yeah, tell about how you engaged with the skiers who participated and what the outcome was.
Yeah, so basically, like as the event got nearer, it kind of blew up more and more as a media story, and a lot of like famous skiers were coming out and saying that we were idiots and blah blah blah. But we knew that would happen, so it wasn't like a surprise to us at all, because that's what always happens when you do this kind of stuff. But what was interesting was that I had taken a phone call, and it was quite random. It was how it came about, and this is often how these things come about, just chance. There was a former professional cross-country skier who came to an event or a talk. It's so embarrassing. Me and Frida, who also works in Folk Mot Fossilmakta, we organized a talk in Bergen like a year ago to like inspire people, and literally 2 people showed up. And this often happens with us. You have to like, you're organizing a talk and hardly anyone comes, and you just have to like push through it. But one of them was a professional skier, and he then was kind of like he was like a bit blown away, I think, by the talking about Equinor and the sponsorship and stuff like this. And he basically just put me in contact with one of his friends who was also was actually on the World Cup and was like currently an athlete. And we just called, and we had like an hour-long phone call like 1 year ago. And I guess since then he's just like, it's been brewing in his mind. We haven't talked at all since then. But Jen, as the event like got closer, we started chatting on WhatsApp again. And he was like, it turned out he's the athlete representative for FIS. So he represents the athletes and their kind of
The FIS is the
International Ski Federation.
Yeah.
So then we wrote a letter from us, which we were trying to get the skiers to basically sign, to be like, we agree with these activists, like Equinor has no place in skiing. But he basically said to me, like, this is rubbish. Like, none of the skiers are going to sign this, because it just sounds like it's you that has written it. Like, they don't, like, this is not going to work. So he was like, we have an idea. We will we'll go around the skiers ourselves, and we will come up with a proposal ourselves. And so we were like, cool. And then basically, like, during the final week of the championships, which was leading up to the 8th, which was the 50K, we were in then like 2 or 3 Zoom calls with a group of top athletes. And it was quite crazy. Like, one of them, the American Julia, she literally won a silver medal, and then like did her media stuff, and then right after came into Zoom call with us. So for us, it was like this real feeling of like, holy shit, we genuinely have put ourselves in like a position of power here, where we are like legit negotiating with the top athletes at the competition about fossil sponsorship. And for us, it was a real feeling of like, it's very obvious that Equinor like do not want this kind of stuff to happen at World Championships that they sponsor. They want to just for things to go smooth, and for all the bus shelters in Trondheim to show the boss of Equinor standing alongside the boss of the Viten Center and the Science Center in Trondheim and the boss of the Ski World Championships. They just want, like, their aim at those kind of competitions is to look like we're a respectable member of the society in Norway and we're contributing a lot. They definitely don't want a bunch of the top athletes to be in a conversation about their sponsorship with us. So then it basically came to it that the skiers like came with a proposal which we helped like develop, which was basically to like come out against fossil sponsorship in skiing and work towards getting like a proposal put forward to the Congress of FIS in June to try to get sponsorship of fossil fuel companies like taken away from the World Championships. So then we basically cancelled the protest on the 8th, and we stood at the side and cheered the athletes on instead, which was actually really fun.
So we'll move on to talk more about the aspects of activism. But how many skiers signed, and were there any Norwegians involved in these conversations during the championship?
I think there's 50 skiers now signed, and I just have been in like a couple of chats with the athletes now, and it's going to get brought forward, I think, to FIS in the start of June as a proper proposal to ban fossil sponsorships from future World Championships, which is quite crazy. It's going to be like really interesting to see if that actually happens. And what was the second part of the question?
Norwegians.
Yeah, Norwegians. I don't think so. I think maybe there's like a few female
There's
athletes
a
who,
few that have signed now, I think, but they
I
didn't do
haven't.
it during. Yeah.
They didn't do it during, and it was really interesting because we had an American journalist who kind of like, he turned up in Trondheim and he was like, "This is like by far the most interesting story at this World Championships," and he just like really got into the story and covered it super well. And he was like asking at the press conferences with the Norwegian athletes, like, "What do you think about fossil fuel sponsorship? Are you going to sign it?" and stuff. And it was really interesting to see how they just couldn't like respond, basically. And I think that was the main thing that we learned from this action period, was that this fossil fuel sponsorship, it genuinely is like a major problem for freedom of speech, because so many of the athletes have some kind of fossil fuel sponsorship connected to their contracts, and they literally say, we cannot speak about this publicly. We can't even speak basically about climate change because we don't know if it will like impact our contract. And that is just like mental to think about.
Is that the Norwegians especially, or is that also among the international athletes?
Anyway, yeah, not just Norway. I mean, Norway, of course, is like, it's a major problem here, but the Finnish team is sponsored by ST1, which is like the Shell subsidiary. One of the athletes that was behind the proposal, he didn't sign it because his ski team is sponsored by Aker Solutions, which is like a subsidiary of Aker, the oil company Aker. And so he was a bit like, I can't sign this now because I'm just not sure, if like I'm going to face trouble. So I personally have a lot of, I think that was one of the main things I learned from this whole thing, was that I have a lot of respect and like a feel for those athletes, because like a lot of them do not want their kids to see them wearing the logo of Equinor. Yeah, for sure. Like they think it's a real problem too. But they're often stuck, and for them it's like it's hard to get money into these sports. So yeah.
They're kind of brought into a position not on their own, but by the team or by the administrators or like sponsorship responsible people.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they see themselves like the women's race on the Sunday. We talked to some of the women in the race afterwards, and they were just like, that was the worst race that we've ever done. It was just so, this is deep of just like slushy snow. And for them, it's like, it's totally clear that climate change is massively impacting their sport. So again, it just comes down to this total failure in leadership. Leaders in the skiing world standing up and just being like, this is not, we can't just go on like we have been doing for the last 30 years. And that's across everywhere in society. There's just this total lack of leadership, I think.
So, but being in Folk Mot Fossilmakta and Stop Oljeletinga, which you were before, you are leading and you are on the front line of climate action in Norway. And why do we hate climate activists so much, Calum?
The media. I mean, I think that's the main problem, is that the media, especially in the UK, the right-wing media, which is controlled by fossil fuel interests, there's so much money in the media in the UK. They've just like demonized climate activists so hard. Like, yeah, and even in Norway too. I mean, we've talked about this before, but the leaders of Aftenposten, which is like the most respected newspaper in Norway, called some people who threw orange cornstarch, which causes zero damage, they threw it onto Stonehenge this summer as part of a Just Stop Oil action. And the leaders in Aftenposten likened them to the Taliban blowing up monuments in the Middle East. It's just like those two things, if you really think about it carefully, those two things are not at all able to be likened in any way, shape, or form if you're sane. So like there's also a problem in Norway, and I would say in Norway it's even worse, because like the newspapers that like Aftenposten that say these kind of things, I mean, they're super respected. It's not like the Daily Mail. So I think it's the media, but I just wanted to say, I'm not 100% sure if it was Gandhi that said this, but it's an often banded around quote. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And I kind of feel like we're in this fight stage right now where just like we're, before everyone's been like, oh, climate activism, yeah, we should all do something, we should all, change our light bulbs. And the oil companies a few years ago were all like, yes, we're now Equinor rather than Statoil, and we're going to transition and blah, 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 blah. Now they're just like, fuck it, we don't care. We're just gonna like invest in oil and gas and cut our renewables, and then we get totally slated in the media. So I feel like we're in this fight stage. But the good thing is, then we're gonna win.
I think the whole thing in the courtrooms too verifies your idea. Like the fight happens in the courtrooms at the moment.
Yeah, and that's what we've seen, especially in the UK. And I think things are just happening in the UK earlier than other places because basically the UK has had like an extremely well organized, fairly radical climate movement and other movements for just like many, many years. I mean, Extinction Rebellion was huge in the UK. I mean, it was like, I don't know how many people got arrested. Thousands and thousands of people were getting arrested in 2017, 2018. And in Norway, we just haven't scraped the surface of resistance against the fossil industry in Norway. I mean, we just haven't even, people here just don't really understand like how far behind places like the UK we are. So I think that's kind of why we just see basically the activism getting pushed harder and harder by the legal system in the UK. And it's come from the oil companies. There was a think tank called I think it's the Policy for, I can't remember the name of it. There's a think tank in the UK basically who got money. They get money from Exxon. And they wrote a report for the government basically saying, after Extinction Rebellion, basically recommending numerous different laws that they could introduce as the government to stop these protests from happening again. So that meant then, even just for planning a protest, you can now get up to 10 years in jail for conspiracy. And so some people that we know are in jail on like 5-year, like Roger Hallam, the founder of Extinction Rebellion, he was part of a Zoom call in 2022 where they were talking about blocking the M25 motorway in the UK. And he's now in jail on a 5-year jail term for being in that Zoom call. I have friends, I mean, I was part of an action last summer where we went through the fence at Gardermoen and we sat next to just on the taxiway, like close to the runway. And it was part of a coordinated group of actions around Europe and Canada too, of disruption at airports to really put the focus on the fossil industry, and especially in Norway, the power of the fossil industry to shape society. And some of my friends they didn't even do the action in the UK because they got stopped beforehand because the surveillance and everything is just like so crazy that everyone basically got stopped before they did those actions in the UK. They're still sitting in jail. Many of them. They're just got put on remand, and they're actually, some of them are getting sentenced on the 16th in 2 days, and they face like up to 10-year jail sentences. So it's going to be really, quite interested to see, nervous for them to see what kind of sentences they get in the next couple of days. But for us in Norway, I mean, this is a good thing in Norway. For us, when we did that action, the police like picked us up. There was obviously a big commotion with, like the whole kind of security apparatus of the airport, like the fire engines and everything came and like were around us. But then the police picked us up. They drove us out the airport. They took our details and they dropped us off at the train station. And we got the train back to Oslo. I was like, when I told people in other countries that, they were just like, what the heck? I mean, that is just, you're really, really lucky in Norway that you're not. We were thinking that potentially we could be put on remand after, because that's what happens in other countries when they do that kind of stuff. So even though we complain in Norway about, for example, high fines and stuff, which we're going to get into after, I guess, we still do. And that was what we really saw at Trondheim at the ski event. If we'd announced in the UK that we were going to block a major sports event, we would have had our houses raided. we would have been arrested and held for 24 hours. We would have had our meetings disrupted by the police. In the summer, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, one of the organizations we work with, Youth Demand in the UK, they held a meeting at a Quaker house about upcoming actions, and the police raided it and arrested like 10 people. That was just like non-violent protesters having a meeting. I mean, we would be concerned about stuff like that happening in other countries. So in Norway, we still, like when we announced at Trondheim, the police got in contact with us. We had a few meetings with them. We told them our plans. We had a good relationship. And then journalists actually asked the police, like, can you not just, these people are saying they're going to disrupt the race, can you not just stop them like beforehand? And the police lawyer actually went back to the journalists and said, no, because in Norway we have such strong freedom to protest that we can only stop them once they actually step onto the track and are kind of like a danger to the event. We can't stop them before because they do have a right. You know, in the democratic society, we do have rights to be disruptive when we do protest. I think that's something that many people forget. Is like they think that a protest is just like going on a march on a Saturday in a city and holding a placard and then putting the placard back into your loft when you go home. It's like protest is meant to be disruptive, and actually, like under Articles 10 and 11 of the freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, it's like written in law that protest can disrupt society in some way, because everyone knows that if a protest doesn't disrupt, then generally no one really cares. And that's what's so interesting about when we announce these protests at events like the Skivem, and also we've just announced that we're going to do disruptive protests at a major cultural festival in Norway, which I guess we'll get into after too. Generally, the response from the organizers is always like, "Oh, but you know, we love freedom of expression. We love people being engaged in these topics, but only if it's like, only if they do it in a way that is ignorable. Basically, only if they stand at the side. You know, they can't disrupt anything. That's totally unacceptable." So it's really funny how people have this like weird. I feel like we just have this weird relationship to protest, especially in our countries.
So I'm just showing here on the screen an article in The Guardian a little while back about how criminalization is being used to silence climate activists across the world. And it dives into how it also comes from America or from the US, from the fossil fuel industry, who has been pushing legislation and terrorism laws and wording, and how countries all over the world has picked up on this wording and on these laws and suggestions and actions against activists. So there's a lot of good journalism on it. And also the latest episode of my favorite podcast called Drilled, they also go into how the fossil fuel industry in the US has influenced terrorism laws all over the world, in the Philippines in this instance. But Calum, maybe you could just give like a short intro to what is the role of a radical flank that goes ahead and do this kind of non-violent civil obedience, and where does it come from, and what has it achieved earlier, and how radical are you compared to those earlier radical movements? Many questions, sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, I definitely think basically the role of the radical flank is to just lift the conversation one step higher, and that is what we have definitely what we saw at the Ski World Championships was like no one was talking about fossil fuels before that competition. As soon as we announced that we were going to do protests, suddenly all the media were talking about fossil fuels, and the arrangers were having to face like tons of questions from journalists asking what they thought.
Also, Norwegian journalists or mostly international journalists?
Mostly international. Norwegian journalists don't like to talk about fossil fuels. It's quite annoying. We actually got told, like, by one of the athletes was talking to a journalist, and the journalist literally said, "Yeah, we don't really like to give these protesters like too much attention in Norway. We generally don't really like to kind of promote them." which is pretty crazy. But yeah, the role of what we were doing is basically just to distill the conversation down to what it needs to be. And because if we don't do that, then basically the conversation is generally just staying at this level of like, okay, the world championships, they're trying to be the most sustainable world championships ever, and they have loads of electric buses, and they have wood-fired heaters in the tents for people at the champion. And it's not like, yeah, but wait, the whole competition is sponsored by Equinor. I mean, is that not the thing that we should be talking about? So I think that's the role of us, is just to basically get the conversation going in society. And it's massively helped by like organizations like you and Klimakultur, who can like provide us with reports and things like that, which we can use in our communications. It's like, I think it's really good for people to think about. I think a lot of activists generally have a bit of a problem that they think that what they're doing is like the only thing that works. But I really think that we need to think of ourselves as being a part of an ecology of change. There's like many different actors who are all doing a bit different stuff. But in Norway, we have many organizations who are really good at like political lobbying, really good at doing membership-based organizing, like Naturvernforbundet, for example, or Greenpeace. But what we lack is the protest movement. We just don't have that part of the ecology of change. Like in the UK, we have that. It's really strong, and they have a lot of resources and funding and things like that. In Norway, we just don't have it. It's like there is so few people who are focusing solely on how we build up like a good, strong protest movement. So I think we're just that part of it, who kind of push the conversation forward. I mean, I guess I have a small example from the climate conference that you were talking at last week, Erlend, in Sogndal. I wrote an article for my local paper here, which was basically kind of like, do we really need another one of these conferences? And it was like deliberately provocative, the title. But I basically just was trying to go into that piece. I was just trying to say like, look, we've had these conferences for 10 years, and it's like we always come and we talk about all the problems, and then we go home, and like it's all very nice. Like the conversation is always very nice, and it's like it's fine. But I was just trying to get across in that piece, like, is it really leading to like proper concrete change by having these kind of conferences where we come together and talk? And it's interesting, like I've faced quite a lot of criticism from people who like organized the conference and were part of it, and they were basically telling me like, look, you're just you're like kind of, this is not a good thing to do, to criticize us because we're on the same side. And for me, I'm like, yeah, but we are on the same side, but the conversation really needs to get lifted above this sort of like conversation about just the emissions reductions and things like that.
So we are talking a lot about that, how much the climate conferences in Norway is about other stuff than reduced oil production. But when it comes to the radical flank and activism, I think in Norway, we don't build that not much knowledge about how the suffragettes in the UK used it to get women's rights to vote, and how radical they were. They didn't just protest at a cultural event. They threw Molotov cocktails into art galleries. They hurt people. And also with the whole civil rights movements in the US, with Martin Luther King being the most unpopular person in the US, and with the slow walking and non-violent, slow marches and the non-violent actions, and he got killed, but now he's a hero. And I heard Dana Fisher, an expert on this and an author, which you and Folk Mot Fossilmakta had at a webinar as well, mentioning that the activists today are super quiet, super nice, super non-threatening compared to a lot of the activists we've seen through history.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think people just generally have this idea, again, it's going back to the media, like the more and more that we get painted as eco-terrorists and zealots, and if people keep on like I get called, klima extremist all the time in the comment fields on articles and stuff like that. The more people see those words being connected to us, the more they just like associate. us as being those kind of things. And I do think that, like, in this day and age, I think one thing to get across with this, for example, the suffragettes, I think a lot of people like they bring up the examples of, the radical stuff they did, but I think something to think about with the suffragettes is that also they were highly, highly organized. Like, they were incredibly skilled at like mobilizing people. Actually, really interesting. Like, my parents they live in Scotland in the Highlands, and there's a house next to their house, like the neighboring house, which was actually used as like a kind of base by the suffragettes. So when they were traveling, because they traveled around the country holding public talks in town houses and stuff in villages around the UK, even way up in the Highlands of Scotland. They were just traveling around, talking to people, taking their contact information, like being super, super organized. And it's something that I really tried to get across to people here, that, like, they weren't just messing around like with doing random acts. Like, they were highly strategic and highly organized. And that, I think, is more inspiring to learn from in a way about them.
Also, a point that's often been said is that you're destroying for the cause. You're making things worse. You're turning people away from this. And I always give an example, and that was when you guys interrupted a national football game. The national Norwegian team were playing against, who was it?
Georgia.
And the same day, Klimakultur had written an op-ed about our cultural directorate and their very shitty new strategy, which didn't mention climate at all. And I was like, yeah, should we publish it? Shouldn't we? And I was a little bit like, oh, it's people we know, and it's never easy in Norway. And then I was like seeing you guys run onto the football field, and I was like, you make us braver because you do these things. Then I was like, yeah, then I can press send on an email with an op-ed writing about something. And I think we really need to focus on that issue, on that aspect of it, that it moves the whole climate movement further ahead. But before we move on, could you just say 2 words about running onto Vallehovin and what happened before you ran out on the field as well, when there was like a minute silence for a climate thing?
Yeah, that was crazy. Yeah, like it was at Ullevål Stadium in Oslo, and it was the 12th of September and 2023, and there'd just been these massive this huge flooding event in Libya, and thousands of people were killed in that flooding event. And it was afterwards they figured out that it was like 50% more likely to occur because of climate change, because of more heat in the oceans and water vapor, and then heavy rain. And they held a minute silence. It was honestly like a really absurd moment, like knowing what we were about to do. They held this minute silence for the people that died in the flood. And literally, I'm not joking, like a minute after the minute silence ended, then Equinor logos like flashed up all across the football stadium. And we were just, it was like hard not to laugh, honestly. It was just ridiculous. And then we ran on to the football pitch with obviously an anti-oil demonstration, and interrupted the game for like less than a minute, and obviously faced like booing and hate from 40,000 people, and like just total condemnation in the media afterwards. And how on earth could these people do something so terrible? And it's just like the disconnect between the reality of the situation, which is thousands and thousands of people dying in Libya, and like us doing a little protest, which doesn't harm anyone. And the fact that, like, even I must say, I get quite disappointed at people like there's one footballer, got his name now, the climate football, the guy who's really well spoken on climate in Norway. Torsby, like, he was interviewed in the media after, and even he was like, I don't agree with these guys' tactics and like what they're doing. And I was a bit disappointed, honestly. I was just like, man, if you really take in over yourselves like the seriousness of the situation we're in 2025, where emissions are just like going up and up and up and up. The oil companies, Equinor, are all like, oh, we're just going to invest more in oil and gas. We don't give a shit. We're just going to do whatever we want. How can you possibly think that that was at all bad? I mean, come on. It's like we disrupted the game for a minute. Who cares? It's not like, it's not the end of the world. I do find it a bit disappointing, to be honest, that even people who are super engaged are not understanding why we do that stuff.
Did you see any journalists actually connect the dots between Libya, the 1 minute silence, and the protest?
Not a single journalist, no.
No.
And of course, in our press release, we mentioned that. Yeah.
There's a great picture with Erling Haaland, the very famous Norwegian footballer, standing, laughing at, I don't know, is it Frida maybe from who was being held on the pitch? Yeah. So, but let's use this opportunity to talk about, because there is legal implications in Norway for doing this kind of protest. And I would just like to share a little video clip I took last year, and it's from Norad-konferansen in Oslo. And it's Lisa Johns from Civicus, who is monitoring the right to protest and civil society all over the world. And they released a new report, and she had something very important to say, which was this.
The rise in and crackdown on climate activists and movements is one of the top trends in Europe. There's an unbelievable intolerance towards climate activism, and Norway is in fact one of the countries which has imposed the highest financial penalties on young activists organizing on climate issues.
So she was really clear. So what penalties are activists facing in Norway, and how serious are they?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that, especially the public in Norway, they have absolutely no clue the financial penalties that people are facing. So, I mean, in Norway, there's a few examples that I'll get into, but basically any act of civil disobedience, whether that's like blocking the doors outside the Oljefond or running onto a football pitch or blocking a road, basically costs you 14,000 kroner no matter what. It's like a standard fine that they give, which compared to other countries in the UK, if you block a road in the UK, I mean, now it's like a bit more scary in the UK with like prison sentences and stuff like that. But generally, if you've never done anything before, if it's your first act of civil disobedience, blah, 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 then it will cost you like maybe a couple €1,000. In Denmark, they do roadblocks all the time there, and it's like, sorry, kroner, a couple £100. But in Denmark, it's the same. It's like, couple €100 maybe for a roadblock, and in Norway it's like for €1,400. So it's really limiting for freedom of speech, that, because hardly anyone has the resources to take that many 14,000 kroner fines. And then there's a few specific examples in the last years, especially like friends of ours, Esther and Fridtjof. They did an action where they like put some paint onto the like water-based paint onto the climate ministry, and basically it turned out that the climate ministry just like didn't wash it off, and they left it there till February and then let it like set in and everything, and they basically then like did a ridiculous cleaning job which cost apparently over 2 million kroner, and they just take them to court and put the entire cost of the cleaning onto them. And there's literally photos showing that like a janitor cleaned the lower half on the day and completely washed it away just with a regular hose. And if and basically there like wasn't a ladder available, so like it didn't get done. And they're now facing, next week they're going back to court. They got the court judgment for a 200,000 kroner fine in November, and like a month in prison, I think. And the Norwegian authorities are appealing it, and they are trying to get the fine. It's back up to like 2 million kroner. So they're going back to an appeal next week where they have to fight it. So it's like another 6 months of, is my life basically going to be ruined? Because it is. If you get a 2 million kroner fine, your life is ruined. I mean, you're a debt slave for the rest of your life. So I think people, and you know what, people are only going to do more and more of this stuff. The longer governments don't take the science serious, of course, people are going to get more desperate. I just don't get it. I can't believe like the lack of clear thinking from politicians in our day and age, that they don't get that. Like, of course, the longer that Jonas Gahr Støre, there was some activists that confronted Jonas Gahr Støre last week and were like, you know, challenging him on Norwegian oil and gas. And he was just like, oh, we have an agreement, the Paris Agreement. It's fine. It's just like, dude, you're not taking it seriously whatsoever. And so, of course, people will do more radical protest. It's like, to me, that's completely obvious. People will get more desperate, and I don't understand why politicians don't understand that. All they try to do is just like repress the protest harder and harder, and basically try to make people debt slaves if they dare do civil disobedience. So it's something that people should really think about, I think, because I think many people think that Norway is like an incredibly, you know, democratic, free state where we can say whatever we want, but it's not as good as you think the more you get into this stuff.
So we are talking a lot about, also in our new podcast called Podden, which we would like to highly recommend. But in the first episode, we talk about who are good sources, who are dependable, who are trustworthy in the Norwegian climate debate. Is it the politicians? Is it Aftenposten? Or is it the climate activists? And I saw a webinar with covering Climate Now, a great global network for climate journalism, and where Bill McKibben, who's an author, an activist who started many movements in the US, and he said, like, climate activists need to be seen as trustworthy sources in the climate debate and for journalists. Because when you look back on the last 30 years, who has been right? Is it the climate activists and what they've been saying for many, many decades? Or is it representatives from the fossil fuel industry? Or is it politicians? Who has been speaking the truth all the way? And I think that is really something we would like to work more on in Norway, because all the climate activists or climate advocates or the frontline climate demonstrators I know are the one who knows the most about the climate crisis. And they don't lie. And they don't, because climate misinformation is also what is not being talked about. And yeah, Alan, what do you, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I was just thinking about when you were talking about the protests, and like if there's a culture for protesting in Norway, or if you are just loyal people sitting silent, not speaking up at all. And I heard this podcast about Alta-aksjonen, which kind of brought me back into
What's Alta-aksjonen?
Alta-aksjonen in it was a huge dam to be built in Finnmark, in like reindeer native people areas.
A hydropower plant, yeah.
Back in the 80s. And it created a lot of engagement, especially among reindeer Sami people, but also like in the general public. Like people were pissed and they were protesting loud, and they did not like obey, or they were really putting their head at stake. Like they were pushing for different politics and different decisions, and they were not afraid, although like there was a lot of police, and it was really really tough. And then the end quote of that of that podcast is a woman that was part of the protests. She was just saying that, well, we were really pushing forward, but nothing happened. So, like, ever after, I have not engaged. Like, she was just completely, yeah, what to call it? Like, they were just
kind of.
they just lost the idea of protesting and getting a decent result from it. They were like thinking about it like something that would end up in something positive, and then they just ended up getting high fines and being financially ruined.
And the dam being built anyway. But
Yeah.
maybe we see a lot of protesting now, also with laps over into Gaza and Palestine and justice. And so we do see things happening in Norway now. We also see very little press coverage on those issues. But speaking of activism and actions, Calum, in Bergen we have maybe the major influential culture festival in Norway happening next week, and it's Festspillene in Bergen, which also has Equinor as the main sponsor. And Folk Mot Fossilmakta has announced a new action there. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we've done basically the same as Skiven, where we've announced that we're going to do disruptive protests at the event because of the Equinor sponsorship. And just like touching on the point about this kind of despondency in Norwegian, like the generation above me, I really feel that. And I think it's such a shame that people don't, like, we have this real feeling of like, we actually can do stuff with these protests, like it works. And that's so clear with, for example, Festspillene. Have now the organizers, 1 week after we announced the protest, they've offered us a public debate during the festival about fossil sponsorship. That I can tell you with 100% certainty was not part of the program before we announced our protest. Like Equinor definitely don't want them to have a debate about the ethics of fossil sponsorship at the festival. So I just wish more people in Norway could get that feeling of like, we actually are pushing the conversation here and actually are able to create like a concrete kind of change and results. So basically we've announced these protests, and we're gonna go ahead with them and do the debate at the same time, because this festival is being sponsored by Ecuador for many years. So it's time that they saw a bit of resistance. I think it's also important that we, like, you know, we don't just do the protest, but we are also engaging in the debate and trying to get across our concerns and worries about sponsorship too. So that's happening in the next couple of weeks. So it's going to be really interesting to see.
And you're releasing a petition as well for people to sign and support the demand of dropping the Equinor sponsorships. But Erlend, last year you were in a debate with the director of Festspillene in Bergen, Lars Petter Hagen. And he was asked if they wanted to end the Equinor sponsorship, and what did he say?
No, he said something like, he couldn't see a future without having Equinor as their main sponsor. So, like, forever, maybe. It was really weird. It was an interesting conversation where everyone kind of saw the impacts of the fossil industry and Equinor, but still they thought that Equinor was doing good through their Morgendagens Helter program, and that made them confident that they could stick to the sponsorship forever. So it was really weird. Cool. I think it's a really cool development that you are now invited into an open conversation about what does this actually mean? Like, what does this sponsorship mean, and what is the possibility of art and culture in like a transition away from fossil fuels. It's a step in the right direction, hopefully.
Or is it just, oh, we are so open and democratic and we want a debate, and then they do nothing about it? But Calum, sorry, you had your thing.
Just a very interesting thing to finish with. I know that Festspilleren, they're really kind of trying to be the Edinburgh Festival of Norway, which is like Edinburgh Festival is like this huge cultural event in Scotland, and it's like known around the world. And the cool thing is that the city council in Edinburgh have actually introduced a ban on fossil fuel sponsorships. So the Edinburgh Festival, who Festspilleren base themselves off and like look up to and inspired by, could never be sponsored by Equinor because there's a ban in the city on fossil fuel sponsorship. So I think that's something that I really want to try to bring into the conversation, not just because I'm proud about my country.
So, also, I think that was said at the panel you participated in, Alan, was that Festspillene needed Equinor because they're do a lot of events aimed at young children, children and youth. And I think we're also working on this on like a structural, systemic level. Is that the chair of the board of Festspillene Bergen is Torhild Vidvei. She used to be the Minister of Culture, but she also used to be the Minister of Oil. And today she is the chair of Vår Energi, the second or third biggest Norwegian oil company. And she's also on the board of ONS, the oil conference in Stavanger. And the interesting thing here is that she's appointed by the state. So it's the Department of Culture who has decided to put an oil top as the chair of Festspillene Bergen. They do the same with the National Museum in Oslo. So there's something about when we talk to politicians and bureaucrats, they're always talking about we need to have an arm's length distance between the art and governance. But then they put these oil people in charge of all our major cultural institutions. And on a little side note on Vår Energi, and I didn't know that, but it's partly owned by Eni, the Italian oil company, who is one of the sponsors of the Winter Olympics next year, as far as I know.
They are, yeah.
So,
I also think it's interesting about like the blunt acceptance of that phrase. So when he says that they need the money from Equinor to do events for children and like young culture interested people, it's like you just accept their entrance into children's lives and minds and attitudes toward fossil fuels. I think it says a lot about the conversation about oil and gas in Norway, that you can just say that without any critical questions.
People just don't see the contradictions. That's the problem. I think they just don't actually. I tend to not try to get too frustrated at things like this because I just feel like they just don't actually know how bad it is, because we've had 30 years of disinformation basically by the fossil industry and just this like influence and positive influence in society. But it is totally crazy.
So after we have talked here, I'm going to a seminar here in Oslo, hosted by NRK, our national broadcaster, and the Opera, who's sponsored by the oil company ConocoPhillips, but they probably won't talk about that. And Idrettsforbundet, the National Sports Association. And one of the speakers today will be the sustainability manager from the Trondheim Championship, who's going to present all their climate measures and how much emissions they had during the championship. And I'm so interested to be there and hear if he's even going to mention the action you had there and the petition that 30 of the world's biggest skiers signed about Equinor sponsorship. But I'm pretty sure I'll be at a seminar today who's going to present all the things happening in the culture and sports sector in Norway on climate issues without anyone mentioning the word oil.
Classic. That's what it's like in Norway.
You know how it is. So we are getting near the end here, Calum, but a thing Folk Mot Fossilmakta and you guys really impressed me with is how open you are, how inviting you are, and how inclusive you are. You're doing events, inviting people in for everything. So if you want to join the demonstrations you guys are doing and support your work, how can people join? What kind of help do you need?
I'm just posting the link to our website in the chat. You can basically sign up for Action at Festival now on the website. So we organize openly, so people can just sign up if they want to join, and we'll call people a couple of days after they sign up. But I do think that, like, especially when we're in Norway, I think the main thing that we struggle with is we have no money. And I think that's something to get across, is that, like, this stuff doesn't happen for free. And our campaign will end probably like after the summer if we don't basically raise money. So I think that's something to get across, that in Norway, the landscape of in the environmental movement, that ecology of change, like, we are seriously under-resourced and underfunded. And in my opinion, compared to, like, how much attention we can bring to the debate in Norway. So I do think, like, if you have contacts, if people have contacts to, like, funders in Norway or things like this, that's, I would say, the main thing that people can help with is trying to push more resources into the radical flank of the climate movement. Yeah. But also, and just to finish, like, I think, doing what you in Klimakultur are so good at is just, like, inviting us in to speak. We do not get asked to speak normally at, like, climate things in Norway. And I think that's really problematic, because then people only ever see the Aftenposten leader, which is, like, comparing us to the Taliban. So I think it's, like, really amazing what you do in Klimakultur, just to, like, open the space for conversations like this, and doing the podcast and all of these different, like, projects that you have going. So I really think that's
So if someone in Norway wants to fund our work, we need that too, because in Norway, when it comes to climate issues, it's easier to get funding if you teach people how to do the waste management and work on circular economy and fly less and eat less meat, which is also good activities. It's not that, but
it's just easier. It's much more friendly to fund, to put money into that kind of stuff. It's easier.
It is. Yeah. So let's finish off with that. Do you have a final remark, Erlend, or should we just say show us your money?
I think that's a really good end note, isn't it?
So, thank you, Calum, for participating, and looking forward to see what's happening in Bergen, and encouraging people to engage. And all of us can make a difference. Also in Norway, we are needed. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.